Hell, it's about time.
Hello and welcome back, Commanders, Cerebrus, and Executors to the StarCraft Lorecast, the podcast where we dive into the lore, stories, and both the interesting and fun facts about the StarCraft universe. I am your host, Jeremy, otherwise known as General Fire, and I hope you're ready to dive back into this universe we love. So, today we'll still be continuing our look into the major factions that shaped the history of the Koprulu Sector, with a look at the military outfit turned rebels Raynors Raiders. So, who are Raynors Raiders? Well, I'm sure many people know about them, heard about them, especially out of StarCraft 2. But Raynors Raiders is a freedom fighting organization dedicated to going against the Terran Dominion from the years 2500 to 2505, operating as both kind of like a rebel outfit and mercenaries at the same time, but would then become allied with the Dominion armed forces after the fall of Arcturus Mix. So, Uh, their leaders would be Commander Jim Raynor from 2505 to 2508. Afterward, it would be Admiral Matt Horner from 2508 and onward. They'd be affiliated with the Terran Dominion from the year 2505 to present. And throughout their time, their strength was relatively changing. They would have around about 300 in February 2500, with actually a small fleet of ships in there. I believe about 10, if I remember correctly, including the Hyperion. And around May, they would be dropped down to 40, but around 2504, they would have thousands within their organization. Their main base would be the battlecruiser Hyperion from February 2500 to April 2505, and then they'd be based out of Core Hall from 2505 onward. They'd have a couple special units within them, would be the Death's Heads, Hercules Dropship, Outback Hunter, and Skeeby's Angels. And they would be formed from many different groups: Raynors Rangers, Sons of Core Hall, and other Confederate personnel after the fall of the Confederacy. But like I stated, Raynors Raiders is a Terran military formation that was once led by Commander Jim Raynor. Does have a history of cooperating with the Protoss, thanks in part to Raynor's personal connections. The Raiders would be formed from Raynors Rangers and scattered troops from other factions during the Great War. The Rangers had left the Sons of Quarrel after Arcturus Minx would abandon Sarah Kerrigan to the Zerg at the Battle of New Gettysburg. Once the Raiders would cease being Rangers of the Sons of Quarrel, their primary color paint scheme would change from red to blue. They would operate out of the Hyperion, a behemoth-class battlecruiser. And upon formation, the Raiders would operate as an anti-Dominion rebel group. And after the Brood War, the Raiders would be marginalized by Dominion propaganda and would enjoy little success. They would be revitalized by the Second Great War and aided the Zerg swarm to depose Emperor Minx. They have since directed their efforts to reconstruction. That's a short thing, but going on into their bigger history of what we know of, um, there's a little thing here from a Mr. Michael Liberty, who will probably do a episode on once I start going down into characters, to kind of go over this situation. It was easy to miss. The Confederacy was dying before our eyes. The Zerg were overrunning world after world. The once terrorist Supremo and soon-to-be Emperor Arcturus Minx was emerging as the unlikely savior of the tottering remnants of humanity. Amidst all this fire and fury, one man and a handful of his ardent supporters turned their backs on the Sons of Korhal and Arcturus Minx, stealing Minx's own flagship, the Hyperion, and would disappear into space. They declared Minx a tyrant, a worse dictator than the corrupt old families of the Confederacy. On the eve of victory, that one man, an ex-marshal from the Badlands of Marsara by the name of Jim Raynor, rejected the very revolution he had helped to make into a reality. Why? Now, this was spoken by Michael Liberty when he would do a expose or kind of during his newscasts and whatnot about Jim Raynor. So, I'll probably go into that story at a later date. But going over their formation, When the Confederacy had abandoned Marsara at the beginning of the Great War, the Marsara colonial militia would join the Sons of Korhal to survive. This was because Marsara was abandoned by the Zerg, abandoned to be consumed by the Zerg due to the Confederacy's actions. But the militia would form the nucleus of the elite Raynors Rangers. Arturus Manx's ruthless and callous behavior during the fall of Tarsonis would alienate Captain James Raynor and many of the Rangers, and then him and many Rangers would lead the Sons of Korhal. Now, one thing to note about Raynors Rangers was that they were actually a very effective force during their time in Sons of Korhal battling against the Confederacy. One of the major battles I can think of and remember would be Antigua Prime, where he had a big part, him and his Rangers had a big part to play in. So, they would be, while on the world of Tarsonis, Raynor would be picked up by the former Confederate battlecruiser, the Thunderchild, on his way to safety. In the rebellion against the Sons of Korhal, our revolution began that day. The day Minx murdered a whole planet and called it justice. Spoken by Jim Raynor. The Raiders fought in immediate action against the Sons of Korhal over Tarsonis. The Sons would seek to utilize an ion cannon to prevent the Raiders from escaping the orbital platforms. Although heavily outnumbered, the Raiders would struck and destroyed the cannon and would make good on their escape. Upon their escape, the Raiders numbered some 300, more than Raynor ever expected. Not all were originally members of the unit. Some were Confederate and Sons of Korhal soldiers that were evacuated to Tarsonis, and at least one was from the elite Alpha Squadron of the Terran Confederacy. To sustain even the small force, the Raiders raided the Dylar 4 shipyards to assign the ships there. Manx had foreseen this, though, and had sent General Edmund Duke to stop them. However, the Raiders would gain the upper hand in the cramped confines of the yards and would make off with the Hyperion and several other ships. This would be due in no small part because the Sons of Korhal did not want to destroy the ships there. So, moving on to the conflict with the Zerg, the small armada would find its way to Char after Raynor was psychically called out to the burnt-out world from Saracaria. Alpha Squadron General Edmund Duke was also sent into the area because Arturus Manx had felt the same psionic call. The two would confront each other but would not do battle. Both had been lured there by Sarah Kerrigan, who had been encased in a chrysalis by a new Zerg brood, where she was undergoing a metamorphosis into a special infested Terran. Duke would attack the new Zerg brood, but would be defeated in a disastrous battle. He would be pursued by the Tiamat brood afterwards. Raynor's forces had landed on Char, avoiding Duke's forces. Hyperion would remain in orbit under the command of Matt Horner, and the Raiders' ground force would quickly come into conflict with the Zerg. During the battle, Kerrigan would emerge from the chrysalis and easily defeat Raynor's forces, but Kerrigan would allow Raynor to leave her presence alive. And it's not exactly known if it's because they were once really close together, not exactly lovers yet at that time, but pretty damn close to it, or if she was just ego trip from the power she was feeling. Don't know exactly. I've been reading the books and I've got through that part during Queen of Blades, and I couldn't really tell what she was thinking. But as Kerrigan wished to remove Ghost conditioning blocks on her mental powers, she would personally lead a force against the Dominion science vessel the Amerigo in order to access the Ghost files. Her other forces would attack both the Dominion and the Raiders' fleets. Protoss forces under Executor Tassadar would arrive, attacking both of their fleets and destroying many of their ships due to the presence of the Zerg. The Raiders would suffer some 50 casualties, but the Hyperion would manage to escape by jumping blindly into warp space. This would cause the Raiders to be stranded on charge, on Char, my bad, at least until the Hyperion would return. While there, Jim Raynor would encounter both Tassadar and Dark Templar Prelate Zerator. He would eventually befriend both of them and would comfort members of his crew, such as Lieutenant Deke Chavez, who had issues dealing with them. The three Allied forces clashed repeatedly with the Zerg, with the remnants of the Raiders fleeing to a nearby space platform with the Protoss. Eventually, they would be rescued by a Protoss fleet from Ire sent to arrest Tassadar. By this time, only 40 Raiders had remained. The Raiders would then accompany the Protoss back to Ire. Raynor would witness the beginning of the rebellion by many of the Templar caste loyal to Tastar against the Judicators and their servants. During the battle to rescue Tastar from the Judicators, Hyperion would provide assistance from the Raynor would provide assistance from the Hyperion, my bad, alongside Praetor Phoenix, a respected Protoss hero. The two would quickly become friends. Raynor would provide major assistance in the final battle against the first Zerg Overmind. His forces would maintain a base on the northwest flank of the Zerg, while Tastar, Phoenix, and Zeratol would attack from the southeast. Together, their pincer attack would drive the Zerg into disarray. Unfortunately, the Dark Templar could not approach the Overmind to assassinate it. Tastar was forced to destroy the Overmind by suicidally channeling the energies of the Protoss through the ship Gantrathor. But going on into the Brood War, actually before that, so Raynor actually did make a lot of friends with the Protoss during his time as a rebel group and whatnot. So, like I stated, he made friends with Tastar, he made friends with Phoenix, and he made friends with Zeratol. In the end, he would also make friends with Artanis, but that would be later on down the line. And he'd also try to help the Protoss in their fight against the Zerg in their invasion of Ire. But if we go into the Brood War, from Ire, the group would continue to serve alongside Protoss warriors under the direction of Captain Raynor and would help to defend the flank of refugee Kalai as they would use a warp gate to abandon their homeworld for the Dark Templar homeworld of Shakuras. After the evacuation of the Protoss, Phoenix would refuse to leave Ire and Raynor would remain with him. Raynor and Phoenix would close the warp gates on their side to prevent the Zerg from flooding Shakuras through it. Though stranded, the Protoss and Terran forces were soon contacted by a freed Kerrigan. She would offer assistance in combating the United Earth Directorate, which had entered the Koprulu Sector and was in the middle of conquering the Terran Dominion, and in defeating the threat of the second Overmind that was recently born. Arcturus Mengs, Emperor of the Dominion, had been deposed by the UED on the throne world of Korhal 4. The Raiders, with assistance of Protoss forces and flying to Hyperion, would rescue Mengs. He would be placed in cryogenic stasis. The Raiders would then flee to Ire, where the Protoss maintained a small outpost near the planet's warp gate. The UED expeditionary fleet would arrive on Ire, seeking Mengs for execution. They would discover the warp gate, which was protected by a small Protoss outpost. The UED would raid the outpost and destroy Raynor's command center, but a Zerg wave would attack the UED, courtesy of Duran withdrawing his forces, just as they moved in to intercept the Raiders. Raynor, Phoenix, and Mengs were able to escape and detonate the warp gate behind them. But despite Duran's best efforts, the United Earth Directorate would activate the powerful anti-Zerg weapon, the Psi Disruptor, revealing Duran as an infested Terran. They would also capture the second Overmind, putting themselves in control of most of the Zerg within the Koprulu Sector. Kerrigan herself could barely keep her own Zerg in line on Tarsonis, where she was hiding out. In return for destroying the Psi Disruptor, she promised Raynor and Phoenix that she would topple the UED fleet in the Koprulu Sector. To do this, she would need the help of Arcturus Mengs. Mengs would be defrosted and offered a choice, work with Kerrigan or imprisonment for life. Phoenix and Raynor would agree to work with both Kerrigan and Mengs, but they believed Kerrigan would betray them. Nevertheless, Raynor felt the UED was a greater threat than Kerrigan because he did know something of Earth's history. Kerrigan would first direct the Allies against the Psi Disruptor on Braxis. During the first stage of the assault, the Raiders would destroy the Disruptor's fusion reactors. With the Disruptor disabled, an SCV carrying one of Meng's Psi emitters would lure uncontrolled Zerg in the area, where Kerrigan would take control of this Zerg nucleus and use it to assemble a force to destroy the Psi Disruptor. Unfortunately, moving further, the Raiders, the Terran Dominion, and Kerrigan's Zerg Swarm would cooperate in an attack against Korhal. The UED only had a small number of Zerg forces on the planet to assist them, but that would not help because the coalition would end up defeating the UED, driving them from the planet. And unfortunately, the Raiders' prediction did come true. Kerrigan would turn on her now former allies, because while they were resting from their attack on the UED, her forces would tear into the Raiders, the Dominion, and the Protoss. Phoenix would be killed, prompting Raynor to swear revenge against Kerrigan. Raynor would vanish for a time following the end of the Brood War. Moving into the aftermath of this, Raynors Raiders up to this point have seemed to be shown to do a lot after the Terran campaign of StarCraft 1 moving forward. They have a big part in the Brood War. They have a big part in technically the fall of Ire, trying to help the Protoss out there. But yeah, I'd say besides the Terran Dominion, the Raynors Raiders are probably one of the biggest Terran factions or most important ones out there. But in the aftermath, the Raiders would remain active after the Brood War, fighting against the Zerg Swarm. They were called to aid Artanis as he rooted out the last of the Cerebrats on Braxis, and would seek to cure the now infested Alexei Stukov the Cerebrats had resurrected through infestation. The Raiders would fight alongside Praetor Tal'Darim and his forces as they pushed through renegade Zerg and Terran mercenaries to deliver an anti-Zerg nanite cure to Stukov, temporarily curing his infestation. The Raiders and Protoss would then escape the planet as Artanis' fleet would purify its surface. Raynor would network and strike alliances with anti-Dominion groups such as the Kelmorian Combine, even spending time on Moria around the year 2502. The group would frequently hit out on Zerg-infested worlds when they could, to also, avoid capture. The Raynors would also aid civilians across the sector whenever they could, notably helping to rescue the population of Meteor Station when the colony suffered a critical failure and they would ask for nothing in return. The Raiders would also often make trips to Dead Man's Port, once rescuing and recruiting scientist Egon Stedman, and once having Matt Horner win mercenary leader Mir Han's hand in marriage in a game of poker. The Raiders would also recruit ex-miner Rory Swan from a Kelmorian Combine attack on their mining revolt. Swan would then go on to become the chief engineer for the Raiders. At some point, Raynors Raiders would attempt an attack on Kerrigan, trying to make good on Jim Raynors' vow to see her dead during the Brood War. However, the attack would fail. So the Raynors would get up to a lot in the intervening years between the end of the Brood War and the start of I guess you'd say, start of the Second Great War, or, when the Wings of Liberty would start. For example, when they would kind of get into conflict with the War Pigs mercenary crew. So, Jim Raynor would be targeted by the War Pigs, a band of ex-Confederate outlaws working for Dominion official Tamsin Cawley. He would offer them their freedom if they would assassinate Raynor. Unknown to the other War Pigs, though, one of their members, Cole Hickson, was an old friend of Raynor's who had been subjected to an experimental form of neural resocialization hidden within his subconscious. During the War Pigs' journeys, one of them stole a Zelnaga artifact, attracting the attention of a trio of Dark Templar. The Protoss warriors would read their minds, discovering their plans. Raynors Raiders had been hiding out on the Zerg-infested world of Eurona Sigma in a tunnel system accessible only by sea. The Dark Templar would arrive and would warn Raynor of who was coming for them. The Raynors had planned on leaving Eurona Sigma as the Protoss felt the planet was a lost cause, and they would begin a purification attack on it. The War Pigs would discover the Raiders, only to fall into their trap due to the warning they had received from the Dark Templar. However, Raynor trusted their leader, Cole Hickson, enabling Hickson to secretly draw a weapon. As Raynor explained part of the history between Hickson and himself, because Hickson had saved his sanity years ago, Hickson would point his pistol in Raynor's face, surprising the War Pigs. Raynor believed that Hickson was being controlled by neural resocialization. And boy, was he correct. The Zerg would then break into the Raiders later, resulting in Hickson's escape. Raynor, separated from his Raiders, was forced to team up with the War Pigs. Together, they would escape to the surface, with the War Pigs sealing the way behind them. However, Hickson would ambush Raynor again. Raynor would make Hickson remember his sanity-saving techniques and the resocialization procedure. And Hickson, overcome with stress, would fall to the ground screaming. At that moment, the Protoss would begin the purification of Eurona Sigma. Raynor and the War Pigs were trapped on the surface, away from the Raiders' drop ships and the War Pigs' transport vessel. The purification attack began away from Raynor and the War Pigs' location, and also away from the heaviest concentration of the Zerg. Uh, but because of this purification, the Raiders, despite the name, would consider themselves bigger than just one man and would not rescue Raynor. However, transport would arrive in form of a dropship carrying large Traxon and a Cerberus squad. Traken felt he had to see Hickson's death personally and told the War Pigs he would let them go if only they gave him Hickson. Raynor and the War Pigs would pretend to agree, but it was just a ruse to steal dropship. Successful, they made it to the War Pigs ship. So, apparently, Raynor makes friends wherever he goes, and the Raiders are normally on board with him most of the time, but many of them do believe in their cause of fighting against the Dominion, and GM agrees with it. But in the prelude to war, uh, the Raiders would become the most wanted criminals in the Koprulu Sector due to Arcturus Menk's media control, oratory, and propaganda, portraying the Raiders as a terrorist organization. The battle against the Dominion did not go well during this time. Raynor would lead the Raiders to more victories than defeats, but their fighting strength was only 1/100th that of the Dominion. They were constantly outgunned and outnumbered. The group's finances would deteriorate. Failing morale would be exacerbated by Raynor's increasing personal doubts and his turn to heavy drinking. Matt Horner, the Raiders executive, was a notable exception to the melee. He remained wholeheartedly committed to Raynor and the goals of the movement. The continuation of the Raiders in this trying period owed much to Horner's efforts. Over the years, though, control of the Raiders' small fleet and the military aspects of the campaign would also become Horner's responsibilities. By the outbreak of the Second Great War, the Raynors' numbers would be reduced to just a handful of volunteers at this time. So, it's an unfortunate fact of life. Sometimes our failings do end up catching up to us, and that's kind of what happened to Raynor. He'd have many doubts, would turn to drinking to solve them because the man suffered a lot. When we actually go over his bio and everything he's been through, you guys will see. But the Raiders always did have the EXO to believe in, but they would always believe in Jam and that he could end up doing what he truly believed in and that he'd turn his mood around. But during all that, after all that, we would move on to the events of Wings of Liberty campaign in StarCraft 2. The Second Great War would find Raynor and the Raiders on Marsara inciting an anti-Dominion revolt. They would accept the business proposition from Tychus Finley, Raynor's old friend, recently freed from prison, to collect alien artifacts for the Mobius Foundation. Trading in alien artifacts was illegal in the Dominion, but the Raiders did need the money. The Raiders would retrieve the first artifact from a Dominion dig site on Marsara. The Zerg would invade the planet shortly afterwards, also looking for the artifact before the Raiders could head off-world. The besieged Raiders were rescued by Matt Horner and a Hyperion. Uh, Moving on into the next ones, it's not exactly known which comes which, but you have the different optional mission chains from StarCraft 2. We'll start by going over the Colonial Saver from the colonist missions. The Dominion would have abandoned many French worlds at the Second Great War's onset, when the Zerg would invade Terran space to, consume Terrans, but also looking for these unlocked artifacts. The colonists of Agria would be rescued by the Raiders and relocated to refugee camps on Meinhof. The colony's leader, Dr. Ariel Hansen, would join the Raiders temporarily. A Zerg hyper-evolutionary virus would strike the refugee camps, and the Raiders were forced to purge the affected camps. The colonists would leave Meinhof and resettle on Haven near Protoss base. However, the Terrans carried viral spores, and a Protoss fleet under Executor Solednus would arrive to purify the colony. Hansen would appeal to Raynor to protect the colony from the Protoss, while the Executor wanted the Raiders to assist in the purification. The Raiders would go on to defend Haven from the Protoss, destroying their purifier and saving the colony from purification. And Dr. Ariel Hansen would... yeah, so... Or you'd have... This is what the canon is. The secondary option is where Dr. Hansen would try to cure herself of the Zerg virus, while Raynor would be, helping the Protoss destroy all of them, yada, yada, yada. Hansen would not be saved because she'd be too infected and Raynor would have to kill her. Either way, Dr. Ariel Hansen would leave the Raiders, but saving the colonists is the canon. But moving on, you go into the Specters of Unease, which is the optional covert missions in Wings of Liberty. So, other anti-Dominion groups would also take advantage of the war. Gabriel Tosh, a pirate and a Spectre, would hire the Raiders to acquire materials for a Spectre training program. Tosh would initially keep the program and his status as a Spectre a secret. He would secure the Raiders' cooperation by offering cash for services and an alliance against Minks. He would send the Raiders to mine minerals for Redstone 3 due to the high mineral thorium content within those minerals. This would be followed by a raid on the planet Belshir to acquire the terrazine gas from the Tal'Darim. Tosh's motive in nature would be revealed as the Raiders were preparing to break open New Folsom Prison and free Tosh's imprisoned Spectres. Dominion ghost Nova Terra, in pursuit of Tosh, would warn the Raiders that the Spectres were too unstable and dangerous to trust. Instead, she wanted the Raiders' help to shut down the Spectre training program on Avernus Station. Raynor would aid Tosh over Nova and would break his Spectre comrades out of New Folsom and receiving Spectre aid for the Raiders and would learn how to create Spectres from Tosh. But you'd also have the Revolution quest line and the Rebellion missions. The Raiders would find themselves on Tarsonis with the Terran Dominion excavating old Confederate technology and moving it via lightly defended trains. This was mainly due to the help of Mir Han and, finding and buying information of what the Dominion was doing. The Raiders would raid the trains and retrieve an old Confederate adjutant. The rebels would hire Colonel Orlon to decrypt the adjutant's data. Orlon, though, secretly planned to sell the information to the Dominion and had hired Mir's marauders to fend off the Raiders. However, Mir Han, in turn, would betray Orlon and resold her services to the Raiders. Orlon was forced to relinquish the decrypted adjutant to the Raiders. The rebels were pleased to discover the adjutant contained a recording proving Mengsk ordered the use of psi emitters on Tarsonis. Mir Han would also have another tip for the Raiders. The Dominion was testing a new weapon of war, the Odin at Valhalla. The Raiders would decide to steal it because they could use it to deliver the Confederate adjutant's information to the Dominion citizenry. The mission would be successful. Tychus Finley would steal the Odin and would use it to destroy 5 Dominion bases. The Dominion would be unaware of the nature of the attack and had no idea that the weapon had been subverted. Finally, the Odin would be transported to Korhal, where Finley took it on a rampage. During the battle, the Raiders would upload the adjutant's information to UNN towers. This would prompt Dominion civilians to revolt. While assaulting Korhal, the Raiders would destroy a science facility which held information about a secret installation on Castanar. Jim Raynor would lead a small force to raid the installation, using the security overrides to get past obstacles. There, he would find a lab and a Protoss-Zerg hybrid cloned over and over within the facility. The Raiders, though, would destroy the facility's fusion reactor, but would release a powerful hybrid, being forced to run from the facility utilizing a Hercules dropship. And this is kind of the first time we would run into a hybrid in one of the games. But you'd still have one more storyline within Wings of Liberty, and that'd be the artifact hunt that they'd go on. On Monolith, the Protoss present, the Tal'Darim, would refuse to turn the artifact over to the Raiders, and to make matters worse, the Zerg Swarm had arrived with the intention of retrieving the artifact as well. The Raiders would manage to retrieve the artifact after a hard-won fight. The Raiders would once again encounter the Tal'Darim on Zeal, a world that housed a Xel'Naga temple, succeeding where the Mobius Foundation failed and retrieving the artifact inside. Finley was pleased with the catch and the pay it would bring, but Raynor was less enthusiastic, wondering if retrieving the artifacts was worth his men's lives. Kerrigan would attack the Mobius Foundation base at Tirador 8, intending to learn the location of the artifacts. However, Dr. Emil Nerud would hire Raynors Raiders to destroy their data cores before Kerrigan could get to them. By this point, funding from Mobius was what largely funded the Raiders' revolutions. The Raiders would press on, capturing yet another artifact from Typhon 11, When the Hyperion would arrive to the Mobius Foundation meeting coordinates, they would instead encounter a Dominion fleet led by the Bucephalus, Minx's flagship. Against Horner's advice, Raynor would order Hyperion alongside it to perform a boarding action. Raynor and Tychus Finley would lead the charge. The rebel leader would break into Minx's chambers, intending to execute his longtime nemesis. However, Raynor was surprised to find Crown Prince Valerian Minx and not Emperor Arcturus Minx. The prince would reveal that he was the owner of the Mobius Foundation and that the Raiders were unwittingly working for him. Furthermore, Valerian would offer an alliance against the Zerg. He believed a device could be crafted from the artifacts to de-infest Kerrigan. Raynor would agree to work with Valerian. This action, though, would provoke resentment from most of the Raynors. Raynor would still press ahead, though, acquiring the final artifact from a Selnaga warship defended by the Tal'Darim Executor. He would gain the respect and loyalty of the crew by beating a fully armored Findlay in a bar fight and convincing them that the successful revolution also required the Zerg to be dealt with. The crew were particularly impressed by the resurgence of Raynor's determinations. And the following is the speech that he would give his crew after, fighting Tychus. This ain't about the Dominion. Our war's always been about saving lives. If the Zerg wipe everyone out, it's all been for nothing. So I'm going back to Char. If you're with me, it's your choice. Just like it's always been. And that scene always gave me chills when I first played Wings of Liberty, and I got to that. It still gives me chills to this day. But moving on to Char. Valerian Valerian intended to invade Char, dangerous proposition. He would take half the Dominion fleet with him, along with General Horace Warfield. Manx would contact him and tell him he was in over his head. However, Valerian would stand beside Raider, telling his father that he would de-infest Kerrigan, something that his father could never do. Once on the ground, the Raiders would rally beleaguered Terran forces to establish Warfield forward base. The Raiders would also rescue Warfield from a battle cruiser that had crash landed on the surface. Afterward, the commanders would plan a preparatory operation to weaken Zerg forces. Finley proposed assaulting the tunnels that Raynor was familiar with, destroying the Nidus network. Warfield preferred to attack a massive space platform over Char instead, crippling air support. In-game, you could do whichever. There's not really known which one is canon, but I believe it's the one where you attack the tunnels as the canon. With the Zerg weakened, the Terrans would bring the artifact within range of Kerrigan's primary hive and would dig in. Kerrigan would personally participate in the counterattacks, but the Terrans would held with the tactical application of the charging artifact. Once fully charged, the artifact's effect devastated the hive's defenses and would de-infest Kerrigan. Raynor and Finley would find Kerrigan de-infested. While Raynor was amazed to see her human again, Finley, under orders from Minx, would try to kill her. Raynor would stop Finley's attempt and would shoot him with his revolver. He would then carry Kerrigan out of the ruined hive cluster across the battlefield. But this wouldn't end the Second Great War. The Second Great War would still continue. Further on down the line, we'll talk about that later, but Raynor had successfully rescued Kerrigan instead of killing her like he had promised, because in the end, he truly did want to rescue her. He truly did love her. And, we all love seeing those type of stories. The hero rescues the love interest from the clutches of evil. Classic trope. But moving on to Flashpoint, in the aftermath of their victory on Char, the Raiders were faced with the arrival of the other half of the Dominion fleet, led by Arcturus Minx himself. Refusing to turn over Kerrigan to him, the Raynors would flee the Char system, along with Valerian Minx and those loyal to him. Minx, though, was able to track them, however, and eventually, all that was left of the rebel fleet would be the Hyperion and the Bucephalus. The Raiders would arrive at Dead Man's Rock, trying to seek the aid of Mirahan. However, a traitor in their ranks, working for the Dominion, Cooper, would convince a group of the mercenaries of the planet to turn on their forces, and the Raiders would head for Space Station Prometheus, a Mobius Foundation base. However, it would be revealed that Nerud was in league with Arcturus Minx, and once again, the Dominion fleet arrived. However, the Raiders were once again able to escape and would head for an Humagen-protected space platform for repairs and would turn over Kerrigan for study. So this is how we get to the scene of Kerrigan, Raynor, and Valerian Manx over in Imogen space. But moving on to the Heart of Swarm, um, on XT 39323, Valerian would continue performing tests on Kerrigan and the refugee of the Imogen Protectorate. However, it would go awry when the Dominion would raid the lab with only one objective: assassinate Kerrigan. Kerrigan would escape to the Hyperion, but Raynor was captured by Nova Terra. A Dominion fleet would attack the Hyperion to kill Kerrigan, and Matt would contact this fleet to tell them that Valerian was a bore, but it did not deter them. The Raiders would presume Raynor to be dead after the Dominion would announce his execution, and Horner would take over command in his absence. But that would prove to be false, because the Raiders would later learn from Kerrigan, who was in her new primal infested form, that Raynor was still alive. She needed their help to discover Raynor's undisclosed prison. The Raiders would contact Mirahan to release expert hacker Orlon to them. Raynor, though, had entrusted Orlon to her custody, and without Raynor's express instructions, Mirahan would refuse to release Orlon. The Raiders would attack one of her operations in the asteroid belt until she would release Orlon. Orlon would then go on to hack the Dominion deep encryption network and would discover Raynor was held aboard the prison ship Moros. Kerrigan and the Swarm would board the ship, and by her instructions, the Raynors would not join the boarders, but would provide remote support. Raynor was freed, though, but he was horrified by Kerrigan's return to the Zerg. And the Raiders would hold off then for most of Wings of Liberty until the assault on Core Hall. While Valerian and Horner were busy with evacuating the civilians on Core Hall, the Raiders would join the Zerg in the attack on Meng's palace. Their goal of overthrowing Meng's was a success when Kerrigan herself would enter the palace to kill the Emperor. Meng's would use the Selnaga artifact against Kerrigan, but his remote controller would be destroyed by Raynor, who arrived just in time to save her, and then Kerrigan would go on to kill Meng's. So, after being rescued, basically, Jim would end up finding and seeing that Kerrigan wasn't like she was when she was infested by the Overmind. She kept her humanity, basically, and would go on to help her win the assault on Core Hall and the basic change of leadership for the Dominion. And this would signal the end of the Second Great War. So post-Second Great War, in the aftermath of the collapse of Meng's regime, the Raiders would turn their efforts towards rebuilding Terran civilization and the Koprulu Sector, and would be absorbed into the Dominion armed forces under Emperor Valerian. However, the peace would not last long, as the Mobius Corps, under control of Amon, would launch an invasion of Core Hall. They would target the Sky Shield orbital platform and would damage its atmospheric stabilizers, seeking to crash the platform onto the capital city of Augustgrad. After their plans were foiled by the arrival of Artanis and his Protoss forces, they attempted to ship the Keystone off-world after stealing it from Core Hall Palace. Their efforts, though, would be thwarted by the combined forces of the Dominion and the Dalim, with the Raiders being, kind of inferred since they had joined the Dominion armed forces. Then, of course, you have it within the co-op missions where the Raiders would fight under the command of Jim Raynor during the End War, fighting alongside Allied commanders to push Amon forces back across the sector. But we don't know whether this all is official within the co-op campaigns or co-op missions until Blizzard decides to, let us know what had happened. But Into the Void, 2 years later, Jim Raynor would be contacted by Sarah Kerrigan, who would tell him and Hierarch Artanis of Amon's continued presence within the Void. Raynor, with a contingent of former Raiders and a portion of the Dominion fleet, would lead the Raynors Raiders into the Void alongside Zerg and Protoss forces, and would aid them in the final defeat of Emil Narud, releasing the Zelnaga Orals from his clutches. The Raiders would then coordinate the defense of Kerrigan, as she would absorb Orals' essence, allowing her time to ascend into a Zelnaga. Finally, Raynors Raiders would aid Kerrigan as she engaged Amon himself, defeating the fallen Zelnaga and ending his reign of terror over the universe. And that would be the end of the End War. But we could always look to a better future. In the aftermath of the End War, many former members of the Raiders would continue to be in high positions of Valerian Banks' new Terran Dominion, and many would remain within the Dominion armed forces. The group would formally be granted amnesty by Emperor Valerian. And one of these people, of course, is Matt Horner, who would become Admiral of the Dominion Fleet and commander of the Dominion forces, I believe. So that's the history of the Raiders that we know. And I hope we learn more about them, but you never know. We'll see in the future. Blizzard, please remember StarCraft. You have so many people who love this game. But moving on to their arsenal, the Raiders would favor reconnaissance and guerrilla warfare, and they would have access to some older Terran technology, such as Wraiths, Goliaths, and Medics. Raiders have been around for a while and would make use of this technology. Even years after the Brood War, many of their ships were leftovers from the Sons of Korhal days. Over the course of the Second Great War, the Raiders would gain access to more advanced technology such as Banshees and battlecruisers. The group does not possess a standardized uniform, and its members often appear rumpled and unshaven. The Raiders would also possess a number of vehicles, aerospace craft, and infantry that are specifically unique to them. So, you know how it goes. Rebellions and whatnot normally have to utilize older technology than what is available, like medics versus medevacs that the Dominion would use. Goliaths instead of, I think, well, definitely Wraiths instead of Vikings. And Goliaths, I think Vikings would end up taking that spot as well. I can't remember. But a couple known units would include the Raynors Raiders, which was a Marine detachment, and their CV Special Engineering Corps. Some known Raiders you'd have in command Admiral Matt Horner, who was second in command under the time of Jim Raynor, Lieutenant Abernathy, and Lieutenant Deke Cabez. Their engineers and technicians would be Chief Engineer Rory Swan, engineers mate Aaron Ruth, Milo Kaczynski, and Earl. Within the CV Special Engineering Corps, you'd have Sergeant Bill Purley Bosquet, who is the corps leader, Lieutenant Chudel Chusi Soro, Corporal Liam Griffith, First Welder Stite, Glitz, Blake Cortez, Dean Mozin Patel, Eddie Rhymes, Drew Roeder, and Dave Warner. Couple pilots we know of is Lieutenant Hathaway, who is a dropship pilot. You'd have Balak, who is a shuttle pilot, and Will Merrick, who is a pilot of the dropship Fanfare. The soldiers, you'd have Cam Fraser, Haynes, Lassell, McMurdy, who also would fill in as chaplain, Rolfson, Gabriel Tosh, Tumor, and Ahandara Ibarra. Some others would be Brellick, Jessica Hall, and Graven Hill, and Lily Preston. Former and or deceased members of the Raiders was Commander Jim Raynor, who, if you all aren't aware, disappeared with Kerrigan. Crown Prince Valerian Manx, who would become Emperor of the Dominion. The Commander, who you played as in StarCraft 1. Lieutenant Fyson, Sergeant Ling, Sergeant Lisa Mannix, Corporal Miles Lewis, Petty Officer Wolf, Private Deslin, Private Gina Alani, Private Lance Besner, Private Non, Dr. Ariel Hansen, Dr. Egon Stetman. Now, what happens to him is very interesting. We'll go on later on down the line. Adams, Chuck Ayers, Leonda Bluff, Marcus Cade, Cooper, Viga Tuno Sark, Fetters, Tychus Finley, Kobayashi, M. Corder, LeFleur, Nguyen, Ari Patel, Sanchez, Melinda Squire, Annabelle Thatcher, Warrington, and Wenders. And the Raynors Raiders are also a Terran subfaction for StarCraft Tabletop's miniature game. One of the only two factions for the Terrans right now, other one being the Terran Dominion. This faction is largely centered around Jim Raynor in emulating elements of his arsenal within the co-op missions, with planned expansion into their StarCraft 2 Wings of Liberty roster later on down the line. Raynors Raiders focus on high mobility, emulating their smash and grab focus of missions and campaign. The Raiders faction starts with 1 hero slot, 3 core slots, and 1 support slot. Exhausting their faction card grants 1 command point. Some unique units for them that have been released are the Point Defense Drone and Raynors Raider, which is a specific Marine detachment, specific Marine unit that you can utilize instead of the regular Terran Marines. And of course, you also have James Raynor himself. Announced units that will be coming out for him are the Predator, the Spectre, and Mercenary units. Their specific abilities is rapid ingress for their sub-faction, which sets a friendly point defense drone unit anywhere on the battlefield, more than 1 inch away from any enemy model. Remove this unit at the end of the round. And then ready for pickup is the other ability for the sub-faction, where once per game, the active unit resolves the Place 12 effect. Models set by this effect cannot be set up within the engagement range of any enemy unit. This resolves instead of performing a standard action. Now, if any of that is weird to you, I understand. Once I get the full rule book, I might just go see if any of you guys want to hit up with me and talk about the rule book and the game itself to see what we might learn of anything new from that rule book in lore wise, because these games do have floors in their rule book at points. I mean, I've played Warhammer 40K quite a bit, and each new rule book does include specific lore bits into it. But I'm still waiting for my stuff to come in. So, but yeah, and I could tell you, I did like playing as Raynors Raiders at the UK Games Expo when Archon Studios had a booth up there. I played a couple games with them. They're pretty fun to play as. So I'll have to try to Terran Dominion by itself sometime soon once I actually get all my stuff in. A couple interesting notes. The first in-game use of Raynors Raiders happens at the score screen of the StarCraft Brood War mission Reign of Fire. Concept art for Heart of the Swarm depicted a Raiders base on Char, though no such Raider base would appear in the final game. Raynors Raiders appear as one of the main factions in StarCraft the board game and as a sub-faction in the StarCraft tabletop miniatures game. The Raiders' Marine speech is taken verbatim from Aliens. In Why We Fight, Raynors Raiders is mistakenly referred to as Raynors Riders. As Raynors Raiders themed banner, war banner, and spray is available in Heroes of the Storm. The Raider Rexar skin is themed around Raynors, and a specially stylized RR symbol and skin tints themed after the Raiders are available for Sergeant Hammer, Muradin, and the Cyber Ram mount. The default Vulture mount is also Raynors Raiders themed. Symbology. The symbol for Raynors Raiders first appeared in StarCraft the board game as the symbol for Raynors faction, and would go on to appear in StarCraft 2 and its surrounding media. The Raynors Raiders symbol is the default multiplayer decal for the Terran race in StarCraft 2. In Overwatch, the Raiders logo can be seen on the back of Brian's tracksuit and on Barz's belt buckle. In Heroes of the Storm, the Raiders logo can be seen on the forts and gates on the map, Brax's holdout map. In Hearthstone, the Raiders logo is the decal present on the Terran cards in the Heroes of StarCraft expansion. The Raiders decal is also present on the Infested Command Center on the Kerrigan Mythic skin board. An inverted version of the logo appears in Diablo Immortal at the base of the Statue of Resurgence. And there was merchandise for Raynors Raiders to include a Raynors Raiders Heroes of the Storm shirt, available from jinx.com, featuring the group's name, symbol, and tagline, and 2 banshees. Another t-shirt featuring the group's logo, name, and rattlesnake motif was also made available on the Battle.net store that I can't remember if it's still being sold. But that's everything we have over Raynors Raiders right now. I know a lot of people, this was the first faction for the Terrans that people were probably introduced to due to Wings of Liberty. They were a fan favorite faction. People love them. We'd love to see more stories with them. But considering where they were left off at as part of the Dominion forces, I can't see them having too much story anymore besides being mentioned within anything for the Terran Dominion. But I hope you all enjoyed this episode. Please check out the Discord. I'll have it linked in the description and show notes below. And just come in there, chat with us, vote on any sort of episodes you'd like. Please let me know of any suggestions of what you'd like me to talk about or what you'd like to hear about StarCraft as a whole. So I hope you all had a good one. Please enjoy yourselves for the day, and I'll have to say goodbye and Taro Adun.